I'd like to now sort of tell you a bit of the story about what's been happening and what's likely to happen in terrestrial ecosystems, which is, of course, very complementary to what Terry's just been talking about. In fact, I would like to emphasise that I could not agree more with most of the comments that Jean and Terry were just talking about controlling emissions. Mitigation and reducing emissions is the key globally. We now live in what's commonly called the Anthropocene. It's a state of the world where humans have now changed the world so much that we rival any of the great periods in the past. Global biodiversity has been steadily declining, and as the human pressures on that biodiversity have been steadily increasing. Everyone talks about increasing temperature. This is a map of what's likely to happen in Australia, with up to about 5 degrees above global averages up to 1990, carrying over the remainder of the century. A pretty scary future. But what's even more scary is this. This is a map that's not so much the actual temperature, but how far outside natural variability that we're likely to go. And so those areas that are really red on that map are going way beyond what natural variability in temperature has been. So what are those sort of changes going to bring about in our natural ecosystems? What impact will it have on our biodiversity and what's already happening? Well, if you're a species and the climate changes and it suddenly becomes very uncomfortable for you, well, you've really got a few options. You can either move somewhere else if you're capable, you can adapt to that change, again, if you're capable, or you're going to die, you're going to go extinct. And an important factor that's going to mediate how that happens is how resilient is the species, and Terry was talking about how different coral species have different levels of resilience to the warm waters. But it's also going to be related to how buffered or how resilient different places will be in the landscape. Species are already moving. We had a whole conference about that about a year ago. All around the world, in every different ecosystem, every different type of taxonomic group, species are moving up hills, they're moving closer to the poles, they're trying to get away from these uncomfortable climates. And that's already having really big impacts on biodiversity, the functioning of ecosystems, and in fact it's affecting us as well. It's affecting human well-being. We had, at that conference, we did a review and just found literally dozens and dozens and dozens of studies around the world in every different system where this was happening. Just to give you one quite small example, an important one, the climate changes, we get change in temperature, changing rainfall patterns, and increasing extreme events. One example, mosquito distributions have been moving with that change in temperature. And of course we all know that mosquitoes are one of the most important vectors of human diseases like malaria, dengue fever, and a whole host of other ones. As those mosquitoes have moved with the climate, that brings them into contact with millions more people that are now in contact with diseases that they weren't in contact with before, and of course that's resulting in higher prevalences of the disease and a lot of death. And that's also got flow-on benefits to the rest of society as well, because that means that we've got increased costs in governing the health system, increased costs of trying to eradicate these mosquitoes and the vectors, and of course a big decline in our own well-being. So things are moving all around the world, but it's not just the species that we're worried about. It's actually, it's affecting us as well. The predictions are that around the world, we could see something like between 60 and 40% of all species go extinct in the remainder of this century. I mean, that's a very scary number. That's more than a third of everything. Up until now, habitat loss has been widely considered to be the biggest threat to terrestrial biodiversity. We've all heard stories about how many football fields of rainforest are chopped down every minute and so on. And that's been completely true. But I would argue that now climate change is really taking over as the biggest threat to that global biodiversity. And even more importantly, it's the combination of those two things. It's the combination of the ongoing habitat loss and the future climate change. To give you an example of that, this is a recent study that we've done with a PhD student of mine in Thailand. That little graph on the right there is showing the predicted number of species that will become threatened, and in this case they're talking about rainforest birds in Thailand. And this is the number of species that will be threatened by future loss of habitat. So about 30, 40, 50 species will become threatened. How many would be predicted will become threatened from climate change? a lot more. It depends on how you look at that, whether you look at the change in their range size or the loss of their population, but a huge number more. If you look at the combination of habitat loss and climate change, it's a truly scary number. If you look at population declines predicted over the next 80 years, we're talking about out of a total of 310 species, about 280 becoming threatened. So it's like nearly 90% of all of the species in the system with that combination of habitat and climate. Here in Australia, in the World Heritage Area that's right next to the Great Barrier Reef, a World Heritage Area that was cited as being the second most significant terrestrial World Heritage Area in the world because of our really unique species. And in the last 15 years of my research here, we've seen 50% of the species of birds and most of the rainforest possums, the things that are really iconic, the things that we actually made it a World Heritage Area to protect, they've already shifted up the hill, they've disappeared at the bottom of their range, and more than 50% of the species that the World Heritage Area is supposed to protect have now declined in their total population size. So Terry talked about the outstanding universal value. This is a huge impact on the outstanding universal value of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area. So the really big question, and Terry also talked about this with the reef, what can we do? Well, it mostly depends on how much climate change we actually get. In other words, reducing emissions, other ways of mitigating. It will also depend on the resilience of species and places and how we can manage the change adaptation. And that's where a lot of the work that we've been involved in the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, NCARF, is looking at that third point. So what do we need to know now that can maybe help us make better decisions about how to manage the future? Well, there's a whole range of things. In that diagram there, you can see that we really need long-term monitoring, we need good biodiversity science, we need to synthesise all that, we need good research, and all of that will improve our capacity to make good decisions. I'll give you an example of that, where we did some work that was facilitated by NCARF. It started out being an across the whole of Australia project. It was then focused on Queensland in collaboration with the Queensland Government. And their question was, what places in Queensland will help protect the most species under future climate? So in collaboration with us and our group here at James Cook University, they did a big analysis and it came up with the best places to protect the most species across Queensland. They acted on that and they've now purchased 7 new national parks specifically aimed at maximising the retention of biodiversity in Queensland. So this is a really great outcome. Hopefully it will have a positive influence in the future as the climate gets worse. But it was really only possible because of that increase in the government's capacity to make really good decisions based on science. We've been involved in NCARF in trying to come up with other bits of important research, prioritising what is the national priorities for research in both terrestrial, marine and freshwater systems that will help us make good decisions. And this actually has a lot of overlap with some of the things that Terry was talking about in the reef. We really need to have new ways to approach conservation and resource management. It needs to be proactive, flexible and dynamic. The same old is just no longer going to cut it. We need to be able to integrate across multi-use landscapes where there's agriculture, primary industries, conservation, all happening in the same landscapes, all being affected by climate change. Really importantly, we need to manage existing threats. Again, similarity with the reef, talking about the threats of sedimentation and so on. In the terrestrial systems, we have lots of existing threats that people have been trying to fight for many years that impact on biodiversity and ecosystems already. And then how to manage specific systems, specific species that are threatened. So when we did this across all of the ecosystems in Australia, we did a huge stakeholder kind of engagement exercise within each of those different areas. And then we've come back to what are the 5 key things that we really need to know about in Australia. We need to understand the barriers to adapting to climate change, how we can change our general principles to be better under a future changing climate. Extreme events are really important, heat waves, droughts, fires, bleaching events on the reef. And then how do we identify the things that we can have the most impact on? How do we identify the places and the species that we can spend our money on and actually have some positive results, hopefully? And how can we change what we do under this new future? So I'd argue in the end that climate change is the most significant threat to global biodiversity, our natural ecosystems, but also to the global economy and human well-being. And we really need to act now to stop it.